Roll of Thunder here would cry?
Well, after breaking down going through my PACT and looking and doing some reflection, I had two basic goals for this. I wanted students to first understand historical fiction as a genre,
Right.
which did take a couple days to just getting to understand historical genre, and then I was able.
Those were a part of the PACT. Those in 2 days, or
Yes,
those preceded?
they were in 2
Yeah.
days, because a lot of my students, they were just questioning, well, how can something be fictional and non-fictional?
Right.
And it was, they just weren't grasping that yet.
Right.
So in the background the whole time we had historical fiction working, and then as soon as they got an understanding that Cassie, the narrator, is fake. She is a completely fictional character.
Right.
But that doesn't take away that these are real stories. These really did happen to her father, and there is, I wanted to make sure not to take away from the fact that these are real things that happened, because I didn't want to introduce the word fictional and then students be like, oh, well, then they really didn't do lynchings and burnings and segregation, and I didn't want that to come up, so I really wanted students to have a real understanding of historical fiction before I moved on to the discussion about, well, why do we need to know what perspective is? Why does it matter that Cassie's telling this story? And then getting into the, what does it add to the story? So my two goals, I would say the two buzzwords in my unit were historical fiction, and then I had perspective.
Right. And had your 7th graders read anything else that could be defined as historical fiction, at least as part of the 7th grade curriculum? Or was this their introduction to the genre, as far as you knew?
This is the first novel they have read at all in school. Sixth grade does not do any novels.
Interesting.
The other 7th grade classes and the other 8th grade classes do not do novels. I believe this class, 7th and 8th, are the only ones that do novels in middle school. So,
and this is partly because this is something that Chris...
This is Chris's curriculum.
Chris being your mentor teacher.
Yes, and something that I very much...
Right, who is African American, as well as being a very good teacher.
And when we started planning at the beginning of the semester, he walked over to his cabinet, pulled out, I think, 5 books, 2 for 7th and 3 for 8th, and said, here you go, decide what you want to teach. He's like, this is what I usually do. So I did have some freedom, and the question was, do we want to read Watson's Go to Birmingham, which I read that one first, so I came in as soon as I read it. I was like, yeah, I love it, let's teach it. And we had a big debate about, have you read Watson's Go to Birmingham?
Yes, I have.
We had a huge debate over whether the little sis Joey dies.
Yes.
And we both think that Joey dies, and we had a big conversation about that. And then as soon as I read Roll of Thunder, I was like, no, this is, the kids are ready for Roll of Thunder. And I think, in my eyes, the non-fictional aspects just completely add. So I completely was in support of this unit.
Right.
Which, yes, this is Chris's book, but this was my vision of introducing the perspective and narrowing in from something so large that's going to take us almost 3 months to complete into how am I going to do a 5-day PAC unit.
Right.
So.
Right. And you're still...
That's my question.
Yeah, that's right. And you're still continuing with Roll of Thunder? That is, you haven't finished the reading of that novel? You have finished?
No, not yet. So we only have a class set.
Right.
We only have... And we have just enough books.
Right.
We do have enough to send home with the students who do have IEPs or 504 plans that require they have an outside book.
Right.
Everybody else has to read within our 55-minute periods, 40 minutes on Thursdays.
Right.
And with testing coming next week, it's taken a pause for part of last week and this week. And we're really trying to catch students up, because the problem is, well, we've had a couple problems with introducing this novel. There are some students who, they just kept reading in class, and the instructions were, you read the chapter, and then you do the response, and you do all the work with it. And we had some students who, they just read the whole book.
Right.
And then they didn't do any of the work. They didn't remember the quotes. It was just, it's a lot of monitoring, but it is like a quiet work period in here we have to have because of the limitation on books. And with people being slower readers then is it was the debate, well, when do you cut it off and when do you say you need to come after school and read this, there's not enough class time for the slower readers, when you have the anxious, the readers who have already read the whole thing.
Right.
And it's a difficult question because I still have students trying to catch up, and we're not penalizing them for not turning it in on time. We're letting people keep taking them home and fixing the grades, and they still can go for a full 10. So I think that makes me feel better about it's not like, oh, well, you missed your turn. It's just now it's a little harder for them.
Right.
Which it shouldn't be, and I wish they did have books at home.
Right.
But.
So one of your objectives, as you said, was to introduce students to the genre of historical fiction.
Yes.
And to emphasize that even though Cassie, at least as one character, was made up, actually the whole family is made up to some degree. But they are recounting and they are living through events that happened in the South during the 1930s, as I remember.
Yes, 1933 in particular. To her father. It is based on dedicated...
Stories that her father told her about his own experiences growing up in the South.
A little older. He was a teenager, yes.
Yeah, right, yeah. So were there other objectives that you had beyond the introduction to your students of a sense of what historical fiction was as a genre? Were there objectives beyond that you were anxious to reach in your 5 days of your PACT teaching?
Yes, there were objectives regarding the perspective.
Right.
Or are you just in terms of historical fiction, or do you mean for perspective as well?
Yeah, exactly. What were your objectives in making students more aware of how the story being told from Cassie's perspective changed the nature of what you saw, or maybe just the simpler question, why tell the story from Cassie's perspective, when after all the person that was telling the story, you might say, was closer to the father of the family.
Yes. So that's exactly, it's why is she writing this? And I actually found this clip halfway through my planning. So my unit definitely shifted while I was doing my teaching.
Interesting.
And I found a speech, it was the 1997 acceptance of the Allen Award speech, and she's giving a speech, and it's her words saying the reasons why she writes her novels, and it's her self-expression, and she still faces segregation today, and it brought in a whole new element. It really brought in why she writes, and the audience of this novel was written for young adult readers. It's at a young adult level. Right. And she brings in the notion that she wants to educate, and she wants students to understand that this isn't a thing of the past. This is still real. We need to educate our students and learn about it. And so that is why she told it. One reason why she told it from Cassie's perspective is because Cassie was learning about these experiences as she was going through. So the reader is going through all these different scenarios with her. Right. Whereas if it was told by an older boy, Stacy in the story has such a more complex understanding of racism. He's gone through so much. It's his best friend who, in the end of the book, we don't really know what happens. Right. The sequel, but we don't know at the end of this book. And he does have those moments where he, kind of like the adults.
William Fan, please report to the office. William Fan, please report to the front office.
Like the adults, he knows when to bite his tongue and to, whereas Cassie will talk back to any white person, will talk back to, and really does get in trouble and causes trouble, and so that's one of the reasons why was to educate and
very
connect.
Interestingly similar to the difference between Scout and Jem in To Kill a Mockingbird, where Jem is much more aware of the deep causes of racism, where Scout is much more willing to jump in and get herself in trouble because of her naivete and her youth.
Mhm.
So by the time you got to the fifth and final day of the PACT teaching event, where did you find that you were with your students, and how would you describe your degree of success in bringing them to that point of understanding the importance of perspective and also Mildred Taylor's own desire that the students reading the book would sort of be educated along with Cassie as they came through the, or at least the beginning events, because you got about, what, a third of the way through the novel by the end of the
Yes.
PACT teaching.
I think students, they were able to understand, I think having that speech and giving them an excerpt of the speech,
Mhm.
I think it kind of, it grounded and it made it real. It wasn't just, well, what do you think? Like,
Mhm.
what are your opinions? Why? And we did a ton of discussion and a ton of brainstorming.
Mhm.
And so I liked that I did all the brainstorming and we had all these reasons, and students were already kind of picking sides.
Mhm.
So I'd asked them at a point, well, who thinks it should have been told from Stacy's point of view?
Mhm.
And a lot of, it's funny, a lot of the boys thought, okay, well, you should have told from Stacy's point of view.
Mhm.
And all the girls were able to stand up and say, no, like, and in all of the females' journal responses, a lot of them wrote about how she was able to connect to the character more, about how, like, why it's because,
She being Mildred Taylor?
yes,
Yeah.
Mildred Taylor was
Uh-huh.
able to connect to her, to Cassie so much more than she would just Stacy.
Right.
Whereas the males seem to miss that, and they weren't thinking of the female connection of being able to write as a female instead of a male, which
I see.
just
Yeah.
came to me, which is really interesting.
Interesting, yeah, right.
Yes.
So the males were not initially either very interested in or sensitive to how the relation of the author to her chosen narrator might have influenced who she chose to be the narrator. Yeah, there are some pretty well-known stories where the author is a male but chooses to inhabit a female perspective. Langston Hughes's Mother to Son is a wonderful example of that, where he's choosing as a male to inhabit the perspective of the mother as she's talking to her son. And it's interesting to ask yourself, well, why would a male author choose to write this very moving poem in the voice of and from the perspective of a female? And I guess that's something that the boys in the class are just beginning to understand.
Because they don't question,
Uh-huh.
at
Yeah.
this point, they don't question, I think, what it means to be a male, or the,
Uh-huh.
I guess, like, the strength of the male voice over the females in literature, and
Uh-huh.
I don't know, I think my females are a little more sensitive to,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, because in my class, especially the dynamics, the 7th grade males are much more vocal than the females, and
Right.
they have a lot of shouting out, and they have a lot of, it's not just like the disruptive calling out, but it's,
Right.
they want to share their answer, and they're proud of their answer, and
Right.
I see the females starting to kind of come back and be reserved, and it worries me,
Yeah,
and I want
yeah.
them to come out of their shell, and I want them to be comfortable to share, and so.
So am I right in what you're saying is that you're discovering as we talk that sort of a secondary goal for at least for the teaching unit and maybe teaching event and maybe for the novel as a whole is one, to give an opportunity for your female readers to come out and be more expressive of their confidence in the connection between Mildred Taylor and her choice of Cassie as a narrator, and their belief that Cassie is the best narrator. And it's also to educate the males to the importance of a female perspective that they might not be very sensitive to right now, particularly in their belief, or at least right now,
They
their
are middle,
understanding.
12, 13,
Yeah,
so.
yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
I would say